let's start our second session on demographic changes and growth potential. Dr. Daniel Sullivan, Executive Vice President of FRB Chicago, will moderate this session. Dr. Sullivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the organizers for the chance to participate in a really interesting conference, and especially thanks for the chance to get to sit in the front row to watch two interesting presentations, followed by two, I'm sure, excellent discussions on the topic of the effect of demographics on output or potential output growth. That's something policymakers have many reasons to need to understand better than we do. Obviously, it's extremely important for long-run fiscal simulations and estimates of where we are in that regard. But even to us monetary policy people, we want to know how much we're missing our mandates by. So I think it'll be very helpful to hear today our two speakers. So we're going to start with David Bloom of Harvard University, who's going to talk first. Thank you.
So, thanks, Dan, and good afternoon, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this conference, and I hope to share some thoughts about the interplay of demographic change and macroeconomic performance and what it signals for Korea's economic trajectory on a going-forward basis. Before I start, though, I just want to say it's very special for me to be back in Seoul. I first visited Seoul in 1979 as a graduate student. At that time, income per capita was just a fraction of what it is today, and the country had 12 million fewer people. Also at that time, Korea was operating under curfew. And I'm here to confess that on my last night in Seoul, I accidentally violated the curfew. I ended up spending part of that last night at a police station, part at a nightclub adjacent to a U.S. Army base, and you all know what that's a euphemism for, and part under armed guard in a kiosk at what was then known as Gimpo International Airport. It was quite an adventure, and all I can say is it's much nicer to be here under the auspices of the Bank of Korea. So thank you to the host for the invitation. Now, with respect to my substantive comments, I'd like to make 3 points. The first point is that demography matters. It matters to the pace and the process of economic growth, and it matters a lot. And in that regard, I'd also like to make the point that demography has been especially important for Korea, which is really one of the world's great poster children with respect to the macroeconomic significance of demographic change. The second point I'd like to make is that the demographic cycle is now entering a new phase in many countries, Korea included. The shift is from a situation characterized by an abundance of prime-age workers and savers to one in which growing shares of older people are the dominant feature. The shift poses some formidable challenges with respect to the continuation of economic growth at the same rates as enjoyed in recent decades. And the third point I'd like to make is that those challenges, while formidable, are not insurmountable, but tackling them is going to require major behavioral and policy adaptations, not minor tweaks to institutions. Now, with respect to my first point, when I say that demography matters, I'm referring to an idea that's come to be known as the demographic dividend. The demographic dividend is basically a statement about economic growth. It's a statement about the economic growth potential that's created by changes in the age distribution of a population. For countries like Korea, those changes stemmed from a phenomenon known as the demographic transition, which refers to the historical transition from a regime of high fertility and mortality to a regime of low fertility and low mortality. Because mortality declines are mainly due to declines in infant and child mortality, they essentially resemble baby booms, okay? Not because there are more births, because there aren't, but because more of the children who are born actually survive. The fertility and the mortality changes that take place over the course of a demographic transition are out of sync. The The mortality declines tend to be first, followed by subsequent declines in fertility. And when fertility ultimately comes down, that baby boom that's launched by the decline in infant mortality, the baby boom eventually ends. Okay, now, baby booms are very consequential economically, okay, because lots of children require lots of resources. They require resources for food, clothing, housing, healthcare, education, and so on. And those resources, as we all understand, don't appear out of thin air. They have to be diverted from other uses, such as building factories, laying down infrastructure, investing in R&D. Okay, and that diversion of resources tends to slow down the process of economic growth, at least as it's conventionally measured in terms of the growth of income per capita. But then something that we call the iron law of demography kicks in. You all know that law because it tells us that with the passage of every year, our age goes up by 1. And it's important here because it means that the baby boom will invariably reach the prime ages for working and saving within a period of 20 to 25 years and be in that part of the life cycle for many decades thereafter. And when that happens, the productive capacity of an economy expands on a per capita basis and a demographic dividend is in prospect. In conceptual terms, the demographic dividend is basically a composite of 5 distinct forces. The first 2 are pure accounting effects. I'm referring here to the swelling of the labor force as the baby boomers reach the working ages. I'm also referring to the fact that the working ages happen to be the prime years for savings, which is key to the accumulation of physical and human capital, technological innovation, and so on. The other 3 forces are behavioral in nature. They include the rise in women's workforce activity that naturally accompanies a decline in fertility. They include the boost to savings that occurs as the incentive to save for longer periods of retirement rises with increases in life expectancy. And they include the redirection of resources that are made possible by the falling youth dependency burden. So I'm talking essentially about a redirection of investment from social spending on children to investment in physical capital, R&D, infrastructure, all the classic drivers of economic growth, at least in that time frame. Sometimes this dynamic process is analogized to a python that swallowed a pig, where the bulge in the snake marks the progression of the pig through the snake's digestive tract. I actually looked and found some real pictures of snakes swallowing animals on the internet, but I thought for after lunch it was a little too grotesque, so I give you this instead. Point here is that the demographic dividend is a window of opportunity for rapid growth of income and for poverty reduction. The window opens as the pig makes its way to the prime working years, and it closes when the pig is eventually digested and comes out the other end in the form of an aging population, which is something I'll come to in just a moment. I think it's important to stress here that there's nothing automatic about the dividend, whether or not changes in age structure actually translate into higher levels of income per capita depends critically on the operation of labor and capital markets and other institutions and policies. Not just theoretically, but also that's what the empirical evidence shows quite resoundingly. And I think it's also important to stress here that the dividend has actually been quite a powerful differentiator of countries and regions in terms of their economic performance over the last 4 to 5 decades. So, for example, starting in the mid-1970s and running for roughly 30 years, income per capita grew at about 6% per year in East Asia. That's including and actually dominated by China, although not sensitive to the exclusion of China. Never before in history had such a large group of countries grown their incomes so rapidly for such a long period of time. As some of you may know, the World Bank undertook to unlock the secrets of East Asia's success in the hopes that they could transfer the lessons to other countries. And they actually dubbed the phenomenon in that book, 1994 book, they dubbed it a miracle, which is basically, to my mind, a confession of ignorance on their part, because you don't call something a miracle unless you can't actually figure it out. Sadly for the bank, they actually neglected the dramatic changes in age structure that took place in East Asia, corresponding to the demographic transition throughout most of the region. There are lots of compelling region and country-specific examples and comparisons that illustrate this process I'm describing, by which income growth gets a boost from fertility declines that allow countries essentially to escape the crushing burden of youth dependency. So the comparison of China and India is quite revealing, Nigeria and Indonesia, East Asia versus Sub-Saharan Africa. We could also look at Ireland before and after the legalization of contraception in the late 1970s. Now, we don't really have time to go into all of these examples, but I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't at least sketch something for you about Korea's experience in this regard. So in the 1960s, Korea had very high rates of mortality and fertility. The total fertility rate was over 5. Life expectancy was about 55 years at the time. Those rates for Korea then look an awful lot like the corresponding rates for Uganda and Somalia today. What happened at that point is that mortality rates started to decline, especially for infants and children, and that was a huge catalyst to demographic changes in Korea. For example, high fertility abated as couples realized that they didn't have to have so many children to reach their target family size, and their lower fertility desires were enabled and encouraged by Korea's nationwide family planning program, which was established in 1962. And the family planning program played an important role in helping the total fertility rate to drop like a rock in Korea from 5.6 in 1960 to 1.25 today, which is well below the long-run replacement rate of 2.1 children per woman. Along the way, Korea started to invest heavily in education, infrastructure, and physical capital, which could do more easily as fertility declined. That promoted income growth, which actually tended to reinforce the process of fertility decline. And eventually, the working age population swelled as the large birth cohorts reached working age. So I'm talking about, and I think it's important to appreciate, a huge demographic shift here. The ratio of the working age to the non-working age population roughly doubled from a little over 1 around 1970, late 60s, early 70s, to a little over 2 between 1970 and today. Now, there's another way that I think is useful to view these changes in Korea's age structure, and that is to look at a succession of population pyramids for Korea. So this is the pyramid for 1960. Each horizontal layer in the pyramid represents the population share of the corresponding age group. Males are in blue to the left, women are in red to the right. And I put a box around ages 15 to 59 here to draw your attention to what I'm going to take to be the prime ages for working and savings. Okay, and I'd like you to just note the pyramidal shape, which is kind of classic in demography, classic of a representation of a growing population where numbers of children dominate numbers of prime age adults, which in turn dominate numbers of elderly. Now I'm going to move forward from 1960, and what you're going to see is as we get towards 1980, there's some notable changes. In particular, we're going to see that fertility decline leads to a shape that can be not well described anymore as a pyramid, but perhaps maybe better described as a pot belly. So this basically corresponds to a shift in the working age population from, let's see, in 1960, we're talking about 53% of the population were at the prime working ages, and by 2010, we're up to 68% of the total population in those age groups. Now, I think it's also important to note that Korea did a terrific job making sure that those potential workers were well equipped with the capital they needed to be productive. Korea also did a wonderful job taking advantage of international markets to sell the labor-intensive manufacturing goods that were produced by those workers. And I would say one other thing, and that is that in the context of more detailed empirical economic growth models that account for these, the demographic and also other determinants of income growth, and that take account of the fact, for example, that ages 15 and 60 are not on off switches with respect to working and saving, The evidence is quite consistent with the view that the superior economic performance of Korea over the past half-century is not coincidentally related to these changing demographics. Rather, it appears to be causally related to Korea's fertility transition, which, as I say, led Korea's age structure to evolve in a way that's been highly favorable for economic growth. Okay, what I'd like to do now is turn to the next main point, which has to do with the fact that the demographic cycle has not yet run its course, and that much of the world is leaving the eras of rapid population growth and rapid fertility decline and entering a new era of rapid population aging. So demographers define people age 60 and over to be old, and I say that with apologies to many of us. And they define people age 80 and over as the oldest old, which is actually an important distinction because the needs and capacities of those age 80 and over tend to differ so substantially from people in their 60s and 70s. Currently, Korea ranks 50th in the world in terms of its share of the older population, the 60 and over crowd, okay, well behind Japan, for example. That's the world leader in this domain. Okay, but Korea is projected to move up to 4th place in the world by the year 2050, making it the most rapidly aging population in the world. In fact, the 60 and over share of the population in Korea is projected to reach 41% by the year 2050, okay, which translates into a staggering 21 million people, almost equal to the entire current population of Australia. Okay, and in that year, Korea's oldest old, those aged 80 and over, are expected to represent about 1 in 7 members of the population. The acceleration of population aging in Korea is a natural consequence of fertility decline, of increasing longevity, and of the aging of large youth cohorts. That's just simple population dynamics. With respect to the fertility decline, Korea now has one of the lowest fertility rates in the world. According to the CIA fact book, which I checked this morning because it changes so frequently, only Singapore, Macau, Taiwan, and Hong Kong have lower fertility rates than Korea at the present time. And I would note in passing, because it came up at lunch, that pronatalist policies are actually a possible way to boost fertility, and I know they're being thought of in a lot of countries. But I just wanted to mention that to my reading of the literature is that the jury is still out with regard to the efficacy of such policies. And I would also mention that even if pronatalist policies did lead to increased fertility, that might actually impinge upon female labor supply, which would effectively serve to dilute the elder share by increasing youth dependency, which magnifies the overall dependency burden. So that's on the fertility side. On the longevity front, Korea is in the midst of enjoying one of the most phenomenal improvements in life expectancy on record. Throughout most of human history, people lived to about 25 or 30 years on average. But since 1960 alone, Korean life expectancy has increased by more than 25 years. And so that would be on the order of 11 and a half or 12 hours a day in, day out for the last 5+ decades, that life expectancy increase. And it's projected to keep rising and will likely reach 90 years within the next few decades. That's according to the United Nations population projections, which are conservative. There are a number of other projections that suggest that life expectancy in countries like Korea may actually surpass 100 at some point in time in the next, towards the latter end of this century. We can roll up all of these dynamic fertility, mortality, and age structure processes into a population pyramid as well. And so let me just show you what those look like. So this is the population pyramid we saw a moment ago for 2010. But notice I changed the box now so it focuses on the 60 and over crowd, 15.6% of the population. And what you're going to see is that's going to swell considerably. It's actually going to go up by about 2.5 times by 2050. So let me just show you what the numbers look like. So if it was a potbelly before, I don't know what that, maybe that looks like a condom to me. I don't know what you think. Because we can all do the Rorschach test. Okay. Now, one other way to view this is in terms of the ratio of its working age to non-working age population. Okay, and if we look at it that way, and we saw these numbers before, those are numbers that went from 1 to over 2, from 1970, let's say, to 2010. What we see when we look on a forward-going basis is that Korea is facing a demographic cliff over which its plummet is kind of imminent. All right, it's about to happen, and that fall is going to be into essentially uncharted waters. Uncharted waters in the sense that there are really no historical examples that we can find that can be used to guide our understanding of what's in store economically or to shape decision-making in this arena. Now, the absence of good historical examples, of course, doesn't mean that there's any shortage of commentators who are willing to make the argument that this is a disaster in the making, and that population aging in Korea, as in other countries, is going to drive a host of undesirable economic phenomena. One example I would mention, Robert Barrett mentioned Lehman Brothers this morning, so the former chairman of Lehman Brothers, Pete Peterson, who was also U.S. Secretary of Commerce and chairman of the New York Fed, he set off a pretty serious alarm in 1999 in a Foreign Affairs article in which he described global aging as a threat more grave and certain than those posed by chemical weapons, nuclear proliferation, or ethnic strife. Now, Peterson's image might actually be a bit overstated, but it's not totally crazy in the sense that the central concern he has is that there are very strong life cycle patterns in work and saving, and the older generation just doesn't work and save as much as younger adults. Okay, so that's why he, and so just to give you some idea of the labor force participation rates, men, women overall in Korea. So you see the pattern, and the time series has been relatively flat here. But anyway, that's the reason why people like Pete Peterson predict that population aging is going to slow and might even reverse the engines of national economic growth. I want to mention also briefly another set of concerns associated with population aging. And this other concern relates to the economic burden of non-communicable diseases. Non-communicable diseases are basically a reference to cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, chronic respiratory disease, and mental health conditions like dementia and Alzheimer's. The NCD concerns in Korea mirror the epidemiological transition that Korea, as well as most of the rest of the world, has experienced in the past century. That transition represents a fundamental shift in the predominant causes of morbidity and mortality from malnutrition and infectious diseases like tuberculosis, malaria, and pneumonia to chronic diseases like the ones that I just mentioned that you see on the chart here. Point is that NCDs could be another significant path through which population aging slows economic growth. First, the treatment and care of people suffering from NCDs weighs very heavily on government expenditure and household wealth, and will crowd out some amount of investment as a result. And second, NCDs keep many people from working as long, as hard, and productively as they might otherwise, as reflected in at least some of the fall-off that we saw a moment ago with respect to labor force participation rates at the older ages. Now, similar to expected increases in health spending that have to do with population aging, which is an age being one of the main risk factors for non-communicable disease, Korea also is going to have to deal with the challenge of increasing pension costs. They are looming quite large in Korea's future because they are driven very, very powerfully by population aging. At this point in time, pension costs are contained. They're substantially lower as a share of GDP than most other OECD countries. But public pension expenditure as a share of GDP is projected to rise sharply in the coming decades here in Korea due to population aging, and also, I would mention, to earlier expansions in pension coverage and increases in benefit rates, basically the income replacement rates. So to be specific about the second point about the challenges of population aging, there are two kinds of challenges that are basically being expressed here. The first is that, or two kinds of concerns. The first is that Korea will potentially lose its roughly 2 percentage point growth of income per capita demographic dividend. Okay, and the second concern is that it may actually have to pay the past dividend back in the form of reduced labor supply, increased social protection expenditures for pensions, health care, and long-term care, and also via capital decumulation as the elderly seek resources to finance their consumption in old age. So what's at issue here, at risk here, is perhaps a 3, maybe even a 4 percentage point swing in the growth rate of income per capita associated with population aging and the movement of that large cohort from the prime working ages to the older ages. So now I've kind of said what I have to say about the key trends and patterns of Korean demography, and I've tried to note some of the salient economic challenges that those trends pose. So what I'd like to do is turn to the third and the final portion of my remarks and deal with public and private responses to some of those challenges. And by way of a preface, I will suggest that there are actually many behavioral changes and public policy responses to population aging that have at least modest potential to mitigate plausible concerns about the implications of population aging for Korea's macro performance. I'm going to focus primarily on those adaptations that are most natural and promising for Korea, or at least in my opinion, most natural and promising. But I'm also going to note some others that may have some applicability here, but also in other country contexts as well. I'm also going to suggest that simple reliance on the market and the tweaking of existing institutions and policies is unlikely to be a sufficient response to the challenges posed, largely because of the magnitude and the rapidity with which these changes are taking place. So my view, and it's open for discussion, is that deep and fundamental reforms, and I'm talking here about reforms that may be fraught with political difficulty, those are more of what's probably going to be needed to tackle entrenched expectations of long periods of retirement and unsustainably generous health and pension entitlements. And then finally, I'm going to suggest that actually if we take a closer look at the demographic data for Korea, that actually Korea's demographic cliff may be slightly less imposing than it first seems. So on that point, let me start there. This is a chart that reports actual labor force rates for Korea in 2005 and projected rates for 2050. The projections are formed by assuming Korea's age and sex-specific labor force rates in 2005 remain constant and applying them to projected demographics in 2050. So a very straightforward exercise. The first row of numbers there is the ratio of the labor force to the population age 15 and over. Okay, and the second row is the ratio of the labor force to the total population. Now, as you can see from the red figures in the chart, the first row, Korea's labor force participation rate is projected to fall almost 10 points from 2005 to 2050. Okay, and that actually is the indicator, one of the chief indicators that people like Pete Peterson are so worried about. But I'd like you to also pay attention to the accounting indicator in the second row, the green figures, because that shows a somewhat different pattern, and a pattern of more moderate decline. Okay, so that indicator, as I mentioned, the size of the labor force expressed as a ratio of total population, is actually going to decrease a lot less, from 50.2 to 46.4. And that's mainly because of projected low fertility in Korea. And what I would say is that from the standpoint of economic growth, those figures are somewhat less worrisome. Still somewhat worrisome, but not quite as much. And the point I'm trying to make here is simply that Korea's labor force may have to support more older people in the future, but it's going to get some significant relief from the reduced numbers of younger people that have not been born, won't be born, and won't require support. Now, let me turn now to the challenges that Korea does face, because as I mentioned, I think there is a fairly potent arsenal of responses at Korea's disposal to address them, or at least to consider. I don't think that there's any one magic bullet with respect to addressing these issues, but I think a portfolio of policies is probably what's in order. One set of adaptations involves new behaviors. Okay, so for example, we know that many Korean employers are already reporting difficulty finding employees with the skills they need. That situation is just going to get worse. Labor markets are going to tighten. Companies are going to soon find that they have little choice but to be more welcoming to older employees. And that's especially true in an economy like the Korean economy is structured, in which knowledge rules so importantly. And it's true because employer surveys also appear to reveal the world over that workers over age 60 are regarded as more experienced, knowledgeable, reliable, and more loyal than younger employees. And I think that practice is eventually and invariably going to have to sync up with that perception of older employees. It hasn't had to in the past because there's been such a large supply of young people coming up through the ranks, but I think the situation has changed, and I think employers are going to be looking much more closely at older employees. And I think we're going to see all sorts of innovations in the workplace, like creating flexible roles and schedules for workers, offering opportunities for retraining, instituting worker wellness programs as a way to cut down on healthcare costs and absenteeism, and also to promote worker loyalty. Here I would say as well that I think we can expect to see an increase in the number of Korean women entering the workforce in response to better pay and working conditions that will naturally accompany tighter labor markets. Female labor force participation has, in fact, actually crept up gradually over the past decade here in Korea, but there still appears, as judging by comparative example, there still appears to be a fair amount of room left for further increases. Employer efforts to expand the flexibility of hours and to enhance child care benefits, including offering on-site child care, I think is likely also to elicit greater labor supply from women with young children. And I think the return on those kinds of investments is going to rise, or the benefit-cost ratios, they will rise as well. In addition to the behavioral responses, there are also a number of policy adaptations to address population aging in Korea. The one that's most commonly discussed involves raising the age of full pension eligibility, or perhaps indexing those ages to some measure of life expectancy. Under what I consider reasonable assumptions, it's natural for people to respond to longer and healthier lifespans by planning on working longer lives. They basically avoid the disutility of work that's nonlinear period by period. However, even in the face of the dramatic increases in life expectancy that I noted earlier, the fact is that most of the world's Social Security systems still offer full retirement pensions between the ages of 60 and 65, and often coupled with strong incentives for retirement prior to those reaching those ages. A number of high-income countries, I'm talking here about Australia, France, Greece, Ireland, and the UK, are gradually raising the statutory retirement age. It seems on its face like it might have been a response to increased life expectancy, and that's how it's pitched sometimes, although the timing and the acceleration of those reforms, especially in the UK, I suspect is driven by cost-cutting fiscal objectives associated with the post-2008 financial crisis, not by labor supply enhancing objectives. In addition, raising the retirement age has created some social and political tension due to high rates of unemployment in the past 5 years, and the fact that life expectancy gains may vary widely among well-defined subgroups of the population. So actually, Paul Krugman expressed this idea a couple of years ago quite well. He said, "Why should janitors have to retire later simply because lawyers are living longer?" So kind of an interesting point that I think needs to be engaged. And I also note here, and I think especially important in Korea, is that seniority wage structures also complicate the politics of increasing retirement ages. Nevertheless, further moves in the direction of later ages of retirement seems likely throughout the world, I would say. Sweden, for example, is considering raising the retirement age to 75. Norway, as another example, has taken a slightly different approach. New cohorts of older people will receive a pension calculated as the accumulated pension entitlement divided by some indicator of their life expectancy from that point forward. So in other words, as life expectancy increases, the annual pension will decrease. And now Korea is set to raise its normal pension age for public pension eligibility from 60 to 65 gradually out to 2033. It's difficult, for me at least, to be absolutely sure because of the complexity of the Korean pension system, but it certainly seems like a step in the right direction. But I do wonder whether a 5-year increase over the next 2 decades will be sufficient to address the labor force and fiscal implications of population aging that Korea is facing. I'll mention just 2 more policy instruments. The next one I wanted to say something about is immigration policy. I know this is a difficult conversation for many, but that is another instrument that Korea has for relieving the pressure of population aging. And it's potentially a very potent instrument because immigrants are often self-selected for their work ethic, ambition, their willingness to take risk, and because a large proportion of immigrants are of working age, which basically makes them a high-octane antidote to population aging. In the U.S., for example, the influx of immigrants is a major factor that pushes the working age share of the population to decline more slowly than in many other countries that have much more restrictive immigration policies. Liberalizing immigration policy, especially for skilled migrants, could provide a further boost to the size and the quality of the Korean workforce, in addition to making positive fiscal contributions. And I would mention as well that the combination that you see in the world of cross-country income differences and institutional barriers that have just been getting more and more elevated over the decades, institutional barriers to migration, suggest, to me at least, that there is a great deal of pent-up supply of international migrants in the world, which I think could work to Korea's advantage if it's an option that they're willing to consider. Of course, I also understand, on the other hand, that the diversity and the pluralism that immigrants add can be very challenging to the nature and the stability of one's social, political, and economic systems. I think the idea was captured really quite succinctly by a famous Swiss writer, Max Frisch, when he was commenting on Europe's experience with guest worker programs in the 1960s and said, "We wanted workers, but we got people instead." The final policy instrument I wanted to draw to your attention has to do with human capital investment. So human capital investment, I would say, offers yet another approach to counteracting the workforce shrinkage associated with population aging. And it does that by effectively enlarging the labor force by magnifying people's skills and capacities. Low fertility, as we see in Korea, generally facilitates that process because having fewer children generally means healthier and better educated children who usually grow up to be more productive adults, no surprise. But based on public and private educational spending, based on the data on primary, secondary, and higher education enrollment statistics in Korea, based on the recently released and even earlier PISA international test scores and employer surveys, I think we have to conclude that human capital investment is already one of Korea's strong suits. And it will, for sure, contribute to an effective enlargement of the future labor force that will, as I say, help offset the shrinking of the actual workforce that comes from population aging. I'm not sure there's a lot more that can be done there, except maybe at the very high end with respect to creativity and innovation. That assessment, by the way, is also consistent with the results emerging from a recent effort of the World Economic Forum to construct a human capital index. The index was calculated for 122 countries. It captures information on 51 different indicators that span the domains of education, health, workforce and employment, and the enabling environment. It's, of course, difficult to know how seriously to take such efforts, but you will be interested to know that Korea scored in the top quintile of the 122 countries covered. And in case you're also interested, I also tabulated some results from the annual executive opinion survey that the World Economic Forum conducts. This is a survey of over 14,000 business leaders in 140 countries, including Korea. I put the results up for China, U.S., Japan, Korea, and the world. And just very briefly, I can tell you that the results appear to indicate that Korean business leaders, so from that group of stakeholders, are generally quite satisfied with Korea's systems for building and protecting its human capital via education, training, and healthcare. I want to close now, and I want to close by reminding everyone of the famous expression, demography is destiny. That's an expression that means that the social, political, and economic fabric of a nation is fundamentally determined by the size, growth, and structure of its population. It was a phrase that was coined by a French philosopher, Auguste Comte, who founded the field of sociology in the 19th century. I hope by now it's clear that I don't share Comte's views about demographic determinism. And I don't share them because I think that demographic change has a habit of spurring behavioral adjustments as well as technological, institutional, and policy innovations that often offset substantially, if not entirely, the force of demographic shifts. That's actually what ensued when world population was doubling from 3 billion to 6 billion between 1960 and the year 2000. Lots of very graphic, dire predictions were made about what rapid population growth on that scale meant for the world. And those predictions, which manifest themselves in books like Population Bomb or Population Explosion, those predictions garnered a great deal of attention, but the reality is that global income per capita more than doubled during that time frame, 1960 to 2000. Life expectancy increased by more than 15 years, and primary school enrollment rates approached universality in nearly every country in the world. What I've tried to do in this half hour or so is to lay out what I think is a compelling case in support of the view that population aging is going to come to provide another example in that same category. In other words, that the daunting challenges posed by population aging will be substantially addressed by natural changes in behavior, public policy, and business practices. To my mind, dealing with the negative macroeconomic impulses generated by population aging in Korea is going to involve some combination of increased labor supply from older people, from women, and from immigrants, and probably in that order. Investment in education, training, and health at all ages, not just for young people, but all ages, is another good bet, okay, as well as reforms of the pension and health finance systems. And finally, I would say that in the interest of a smooth macroeconomic glide path to an older population, I would just urge that Korean policymakers don't wait too long to get started. So, thank you.
Thank you, David. That was extremely interesting. Our next speaker today is Axel Bursch-Supan from the Max Planck Institute.
Thank you. Thank you for getting me here. It's an honor to speak here. I don't have stories like you. Luckily, I came fresh from the airport rather than almost the prison. So I will talk a little bit about the macroeconomics of aging in Europe. Why should you be interested in Europe? And there are two reasons. Europe is, and particularly the old countries in Europe, like Germany and Italy, they're about 25 years ahead of the demographic change in Korea. So you actually see what will happen in Korea in 25 years in Europe right now. And I make a similar argument in the United States, where the difference is about 15 years, a little bit less, but also considerably later in the United States. The main feature I want to talk about, not only in the talk itself, but also in the formal model, which is behind what I would say, is that the interaction between economics and policy is what really will drive what will happen. And just to start with your last slide, David, demography, we share that, is not destiny. It's really the policy which we make, and that will show up in the numbers. Okay, that demography matters has been said before. It also matters for central banks, and it also matters in some instances which may be less known. This is a graph which I like to show, which shows what has happened in terms of pension expenditures and may explain parts of the crisis. This is a pretty crowded graph. What you see is projections of pension expenditures over the next 40 years. And you see the countries. United States, very little change. European Union, considerable change, including Germany. And then you see two countries which I may want to point out, which is Spain and Greece, where pension expenditures just explode. And I think pension expenditures in Korea are now like 3% of GDP, in that order of magnitude. In Greece, they are predicted to be 25% of GDP, a quarter. Now, the interesting number is the little red numbers, which is the implicit debt which is created by these pension systems. And that is why I'm saying this here in the Bank of Korea. The implicit debt, even in a country which seems well governed like Germany, is 200% or 190%. So this is 3 times as much as the state deficit which is on the books. If you go to Greece, it's 700%, and we know that the current deficit in Greece is about 180, 160, between about 180%. So the implicit debt, in addition to the explicit debt, is way larger. That is anticipated by the markets. And unless we don't get these demographically driven pension increases under control, I think we'll not see a quiet on the capital markets. I put down Standard & Poor's, Moody's, Fitch ratings. They know exactly that these reforms to actually cut down the pension promise will be so hard that part of the implicit debt will eventually be turned over in explicit debt and will actually have sort of will diminish the ability to reduce the current crisis phenomena in these countries, particularly Greece and Spain. So demography is important, and it is important also for the current crisis and the long-run outlook. And I think that this is still underappreciated. Without pension reform, these countries will not get out of their deep valley right now. Let's look a little bit at the numbers very quickly. Actually, I'm just repeating what David has mentioned before. Demography is much later, sort of the demographic change in Korea than it is in Europe, but it will be much faster. And the number, again, are just the sheer numbers are huge. Let's just pick out two numbers. The old age dependency ratio in Germany will double. In Korea, it will be quadruple. Pension expenditures in Germany will go up 50%. Under the current regime of pension regulations, they will quintuple in Korea. So these are huge changes. And again, I repeat, you cannot do very much about the demography itself, but the consequences, for example, in pension policy, they're in the hand of politicians. Let me get a little bit more analytical. There are 3 mechanisms which drive demography, and they're different in different countries. One is the baby boom, baby bust transition. This is for Germany. And you see this is a huge transition. You see all these people who were born in the 50s and 60s and now become retirees in the next 10 years. So that's one change. The other change is longevity. The numbers are, again, mind-boggling, about 2.5 years every decade. Now, if you think a little bit in terms of macroeconomic growth potential, what does longevity mean? Nothing bad. It actually increases the resources you have in an economy. And that is a point which is rarely made. Longevity is actually a boost for growth unless you screw it up by keeping the retirement age the same. The third one is fertility, and we have seen these huge declines in fertility in Europe, but also in Korea. The reason to distinguish these three elements of demography is that you have to have at least three policy instruments to actually cope with them. And they're quite obvious. For the baby boom, baby bust transition, that's a transitory phenomenon, right? Because the baby bust eventually will, the baby boom will eventually die. So pre-funding mechanisms will actually help. That's what we usually do. Saving for rainy days in a grand scale can help in terms of demography here. Also, fiscal consolidation is important here. And that runs counter of something we have heard early in the morning. I actually like the remark that sustainability is at issue here very often. In terms of demography, fiscal consolidation is important. Fiscal expansion will actually make things worse in 10 or 15 years. Longevity, of course, increasing the retirement age. And as a policy, vis-à-vis the fertility decline, well, one is increase the quantity again. This is pronatal policies, and I agree with David. We do not have good evidence that they work. The other one is the usual trade-off. If we have fewer kids and we cannot increase quantity, well, we at least have to increase quality. So education, investing in education and keeping these people healthy is an important instrument against the fertility decline. I'll come back to these policies in a minute. Without those policies, the macroeconomic consequences are straightforward. We have lower labor input, and this may actually be amplified, the lower input, by negative incentive effects. If taxes, contributions go up to feed the elderly, to keep them healthy, then you have labor force reduction due to negative incentive effects. Some people claim there's lower capital inputs because there will be less saving. That's controversial. And even more controversial is the claim that an aging economy will have a lower productivity. There's no good evidence that productivity declines with age. For standard jobs, that is important for standard jobs. Nobel Prizes are usually won early. But if you're on the production line, then the changes are not that large. And that, of course, spells lower GDP per capita and lower living standards in terms of consumption per capita. What is the order of magnitude? If you try to measure the force of aging, and you think that this is essentially the loss in productive capacity, the loss of younger people, then you can actually draw a line like this. You see that is negative. And to make a long story short, the loss is about between 1.5% per year and 2%. So it's large. This is the loss in labor capacity if everything stays constant. So age-specific and gender-specific labor force participation rate. What you also see in these three countries, which I have on the slide here, is that the timing of these changes is very different. And that is an interesting kind of aspect which gives rise for international diversification and international division of labor. What will happen in detail? Labor gets scarce, so in tendency, wages will go up. In turn, capital is more abundant, which means returns will go down. Some people were talking about asset meltdowns. You will see numbers which are much less than what that word suggests. The international differences precipitate flows of capital and labor. Production will go in countries where there are more younger workers, and capital will flow into countries where returns are higher. And that happens to quite some extent. So if you look at the timeline of these changes, There will be saving in the aging countries, foreign investment of the aging countries, and some repatriation as then pension and consumption during retirement will be financed. And for Europe, the turning point is about 2035. Now, these behavioral responses to aging are small relative to policy-driven changes. And that is a big message of my presentation here. Just to make a very specific example of a labor reform package, just go through the lines here. Increase the retirement age by 2 years, decrease the job entry age by 2 years, which is possible in Europe because they start late. Increase the female labor force participation, get the unemployment down to the national rate. This adds together some 15% of the labor force in countries like Germany, France, or Italy. So you see that's a big change. Similarly, in pension policies, currently mostly in central continental Europe, we have DB pensions, public and mainly public DB pensions with a fixed replacement rate, very generous. If we would change them to defined contribution pension systems, where the contribution rate is fixed but not the replacement, where the replacement actually responds in some way to the aging, the retirement income composition would change dramatically. Now, what I want to show you is that if I go back to the labor market policies and to the pension policies, that these are the real driver of what will happen in terms of growth over the next 25 to 30 years in Europe. Okay? So again, to drive home the point that demography per se is not what drives growth potential in the future, but how we react to demography and the specific policies. Now, there's unfortunately a third element. So there's labor market policies, there's pension policies, but then the actual responses to those policies. And this is where this paper sort of gets interesting. If we look back over the last 20, 40, 50 years in Europe, then sort of as a rule, a lot of policies have actually been done, but behavioral responses were negative. So a part of the theoretical effect of these policies has been vanished in resistance to reforms and substitution away from intended effects. And we try actually to model those and calibrate a model accordingly. Now, this is tricky. If you think about what the potential behavioral effects are, one is saving. Okay? And you all know savings over the life cycle is affected in one way or the other, and obviously a pension reform will change the savings path quite a bit. Labor market reforms are supposedly changing the potential for labor. But whether that potential is used or not, that is endogenous and depends on household reaction. So I modeled this actually as a two-part thing. This is what policy does. It gives more possibilities to actually work longer by changing the retirement age, by changing the work week in France from 35 hours to 38 hours and so forth. But then there will be behavioral reaction, and not 100% maybe actually be used up by these changes. And I calibrate these models, and actually I use data from the last 50 years to go through. I don't have time to go through this model in detail. It has concentrates on France, Germany, and Italy as the key continental European countries. It's an open economy, has lots of equations, which I obviously don't show. Now, here's the outcome. The first interesting thing is this is what demography does. The support ratio, which is the number of workers per population, will go down, actually by about 20% if you look at the numbers. The economic reaction is much less. GDP per capita goes down by about 15%. And if you look at consumption per capita, it only goes down by 10%, Why so? This is due to international diversification. And this is why it's important, if you talk demography in the long run, to distinguish GDP from GDNP. Shifting production to the younger countries, shifting your capital allocation to the younger countries makes a huge difference and actually allows you to smooth, even without any other policy measures. Okay? That's message number one. Okay, and these capital flows are large in terms of GDP. The next one is the impact of labor market reforms, and again, you see they are huge. They can be huge. The support ratio, essentially, if you do what I have lined out, later retirement, more female labor force participation, you can almost neutralize in these countries the population aging. And I think that is also important for Korea. There is enough room, particularly in female labor force participation, which can undo part of the aging. Now, this works through the capital stock, GDP per capita, consumption per capita, if and if only if the people do go 2 years later into retirement, start their job 2 years earlier, and so forth. If we go through the behavioral effects, they actually are negative. Now, this is European data. If you would calibrate this in America, I would say the behavioral effects, the negative behavioral effects, are actually smaller. I don't know about Asia. But in Europe, you have seen over the past 50 years strong resistance against reforms. These reforms are undone by later governments. This is what we have seen in France, where Hollande took over from Sarkozy. We have seen it even in the new Italian governments who have undone some of the Monti reforms. And very lately, we also have seen it in Germany, where the current government has undone reforms which have been done between 2000 and 2010, to which Dave Turner actually alluded to earlier today. So that's a message, and a more depressive message. If we add pension reform, it adds somewhat, but little. The point here is labor market reforms are the key in going ahead in population aging. Second to last slide, if you sum all this up, all the combinations of labor market reform, pension reform, behavioral reaction, no behavioral reactions, you see this mess of a graph which tells you that anything is possible. If you're smart and behavioral effects are not too strong, aging can essentially be completely compensated for by policies. So demography is definitely not our destiny. But if we fail, we don't do the reforms, and the behavioral effects kick in, then it gets lower and lower, and we may end up in losing 10% of consumption capabilities, which is a lot, and which we are completely unused to. We are always used that it goes uphill. So there is the takeaway points here. There is, in theory, sufficient labor supply, at least in Europe, and saving capacity to offset aging. And I think I'm pretty convinced that, looking at the numbers, but much more superficially, that this also holds for Korea. But there has been strong non-compliance to reform. And this has undone a lot of good policies in the past. And this is what we really have to look forward. The international diversification is actually important and helpful. So one can make use of these huge differences in demography within Europe, but particularly between the Asia, the United States, Africa, and Europe. Africa, I think, really 20, 30, 40 years ahead from now as a source of growth. I have put some caveats in for those who want to go through the model. As all these models, they have some strong assumptions, but the main messages are clear. Demography is not destiny, but the policies which we enact over the next 10, 20 years. This is our destiny. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Axel. Our first discussant is Yang-Soon Chang from Rochester University and Yonsei University.
First, I would like to thank organizers and the BOK for giving me an opportunity to discuss this paper. I learned a lot from this reading these papers. So let me just start with a map. So this is a map based on United Nations data. So this is a map of elderly year 2000. So if you look at the area with the blue color, that's the area where here elderly is population of age over 65. So blue area is 15 to 22.5% of fractional population over 65. And then gray area is the country or area with fractional population over 65 is between 7.5 to 15%. So it's largely Western European countries and Japan. They are older countries, and then also a lot of developed countries in gray area. But if you move this clock forward by 50 years, then this is the map of elderly year 2050. Now the area with the blue and white color, that's the area where fractional population over 65 is actually 30% or higher. So this is the area U.S. And then European countries. In China, China is actually one of the fastest aging country because of one-child policy. So this is also a fast aging country, and Korea and Japan and Australia. And then also there's a lot of blue areas too. The black area, which is actually surprisingly a lot of Latin American countries that belongs to also old countries where fractional population over 65 is actually higher than 22.5% to 30%. And so basically the world is aging in a fast rate. And then, so I will just give you two extreme countries. So one is Japan and the other is Liberia. So it's Japan, again, according to the United Nations projection. So if you look at the fractional population, the black area is actually population age over 100. So if you look at this figure, I don't know whether you care about year 2300, but so at that time, like more than 10% of population is age over 100 in Japan. By contrast, Liberia, actually it's a young country. Still, it's aging, at some point start aging fast. And then these two countries I show as extreme cases that shows that we face this fast aging period. So, and then the next one is the world population composition. So if you see this, this is again based on United Nations projection. So you see the fast increasing world population, but at some point it's converged to or stabilized around 2050. So by 2050, you see there's a huge fractional population in Asia and Africa, actually. And then look at the European portion; it becomes fairly stable already in 2000, and then it's actually decreasing in terms of fraction. Okay. So the bottom line is we face this fast aging society in the world, and then this is again one of the life cycle figure. This is Asian countries altogether. So if you see starting from 1950s and moving forward, you see that the peak point is moving slowly to the now. By now it's around like 40, okay? And the moving becomes older and older. And this is actually the next one is Africa. So the Africa is still really young, even by year 2050. So you see the peak is still at the infant age. Okay. So so according to United Nations predictions, by year 2050, the largest country in the world in terms of population is India, and the second is China, and the third is USA, and the fourth is actually Nigeria. And then fifth is Indonesia. So I'm showing you Nigeria and Indonesia just to give you an idea that these two countries, in terms of size of population, will become a major force in the world economy. So if you look at Indonesia, actually Indonesia shows reached this the black dotted lines are working age population to non-working age population ratio. So Nigeria, the Indonesia actually reached a peak by year 2020 and then comes down. So it's aging. But Nigeria continued to rise, so it's still very young. So population aging is everywhere. And then I guess the two papers that we saw addresses major concerns in terms of economic growth. And then the source of concern is actually, one is lack of labor force. So economy probably will not have enough young workers. And then also the second concern is if you have a social security, that's going to be a fiscal burden because of high dependency ratio. And also as an individual household, the longevity is actually could be a burden in terms of financing your consumption in the later stage of your life. So I think I'm convinced, given the limited reading of this literature, I'm convinced that this is an important issue we have to think about. And then, but in this literature, you use like a language that's behavioral response, but I would say it's like market force. So market always respond to such changes. And then, so there are three things I listed here, which actually is addressed already by the presenters. So first one is about retirement age, and the second is about female labor force participation, and then third is about increased immigration. So first, about retirement age, in Korean case, one thing that I was surprised was I had one of my students who's comparing labor supply across countries, and I thought that given the mandatory retirement, labor force participation will be low for elderly in Korea, but in fact, it wasn't. The reason is they retire actually, they leave their, let's say, their corporation, for example, but then they'll receive this retirement as a lump sum in Korea. Most companies actually, it's not unlike U.S. where you have a flow of retirement fund. They actually get lump sum, and then they use this money to open a small business. And this small business, like a 7-Eleven, I know a lot of older people actually started these small restaurants or small shops, or these convenience stores. And these small shops are actually very, very risky. The retail stores turnover rate is very high. And then some of them actually lose their pension fund. So the economic well-being of elderly and how they manage this pension plan could be an important social issue. So let me just get to this a little bit more detail. So one of the concept that this literature is what they call demographic window. Demographic window is they divide demographic change in 3 stages. The first stage is when the population of age under 15 is larger than 30%. This is like a young economy. And the second stage is population of under age 15 is less than 30%. And then population age over 65 is still less than 50%. So it's like in the middle stage. And the third stage is now population over 65, the fraction becomes higher than 15%. So this second stage referred to as a demographic window where actually the dependency ratio has start turning around. So let me just show you the projection by, again, United Nations. So this U.S. The first one, Europe, is actually the dependence ratio is declining. And then the U.S. actually has double dips in terms of dependence rate, probably due to baby boom generation. So Europe actually passed this window stage already. So that means if you try to do like a social security reform, it's too late already in some sense. So if you want to think ahead as a policymaker, you might want to try to do a reform during this stage when you actually when economy is about to hit the bottom. And then if you look at the last one, that's Africa. So it's still a long time ahead for Africa in terms of dependence ratio actually hitting the bottom. And then Asia, actually, about the time to think about the reform if you want to have a social security. Okay, and then let me just so I think one thing that's not really touched upon is actually housing market. But if you live in Japan and Korea, housing market is closely related to the aging population. So I think aging predicts a weak demand for housing in general, I guess. And then if you look at the U.S. economy and other economies, housing market is one of the most reliable indicator of aggregate business cycles. For the U.S. economy since World War II, there have been 11 housing market busts, and then 9 out of 11 actually led to aggregate recession, and 2 of them didn't. But that's coincidental or maybe coincidence, and then it's immediately followed by 2 major wars. So the economy didn't get into a recession immediately. And then I guess there's also a lot of discussion about lost decades in Japan has closely related to the aging population. So any economy that face aging population also have to think about how the housing market is going to respond, and then this could be an important issue for the policymakers. Okay? And then let me just talk a little bit about female labor supply. So there's a fast increase in female labor supply in Korea and other countries. And then in U.S., it's getting close to men's. So let me just give you an example about how fast things have changed in Korea. So one of my former colleagues, Mark Agia, who is now at Princeton, he used to work at the U.S. Embassy here in early 90s as a visa officer. So I always tell him that given your intelligence, I mean, spending whole day stamping visa doesn't make sense. So you must be an agent. But he never confessed. But the story he told me was he tried to recruit workers, local staff workers locally. And then he always ended up with hiring female workers. The reason is that the pool of applicants to U.S. Embassy, there's highly talented female workers because it's a society highly discriminatory. So they apply to U.S. Embassy because it's less discriminatory. But now it has changed a lot. I mean, completely changed. Now BOK has a new deputy governor who is female, and so on. And then, so let me just show you the labor supply. This by cohort. So this is like old cohort, flat, and then young cohort, a little bit of a life cycle. This is hours by age. And then this is women. So if you look at the cohort of 1986, that's I mean, at some point nobody works because of child birth. And then now they look more like a man. So the women labor supply is now very much like man labor supply. Okay? So let me just, and then let me just talk a little bit about immigration. So the immigration is also, there's fast change in immigration in Korea. So for example, so nowadays, 3 out of 10 marriages in rural area are international marriages in Korea. So there's a shortage of men in rural area, and then they import brides, okay? Which is quite striking given the completely isolated society for a long while. So let me just go. So I'm convinced that this is an important issue, and then but I think it's, we sound too much like Malthus, who didn't really foresee the change and then how the, I mean, the forces that change the population dynamics. So I guess we may be too pessimistic in the sense that I guess if you think about like a directed R&D, I guess the market will find a way to make use of these old workers. I'm pretty sure that there will be a lot of demand going ahead. And then the elderlies are these days, they call elderly, like age over 65. They are very active and healthy. So there's a tradition in Korea where children throw a big party for their parents when the age is like 61. So when I brought this idea to my parents like 10 years ago, they took it as an insult. Because I mean, it's so healthy and everybody survives. So so that means I think there's a lot of use. The market will find a way to take advantage of this old population So that means I think we have to be a little bit more optimistic. We don't want to make economics more, again, like dismal science. Okay, so let me just close. So it's a potential threat to economic growth and also important challenge for policymakers. But I think it may be also an opportunity for new era. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Young Sung. And our final discussant is Hyun Chung Kim from the Bank of Korea.
Good afternoon. I'm very glad and honored to be able to participate in this wonderful conference along with such wonderful participants. The paper presented by Dr. Borges-Ban is, I think, mostly focused on EU countries, but I think it has many implications for emerging market economies as well. And also, it raises some intriguing questions for the emerging market economies as well. So instead of delving into specific models, I'd like to discuss from a more general point of view. Okay, before starting, usual disclaimer applies here too. As you know, recently growth momentum of the global economy seems to keep improving, but still many uncertainties still remain surround the path of the world economy. This is because several headwinds, significant headwinds, which can be transitory or structural. In particular, labor productivity growth slowed down, and population aging has drawn much attention as key challenges. For the latter, even EMEs, particularly Korea and China, and as Dr. Chung showed, even South America, already face rapidly progressing demographic aging. So these charts show in Korea and China, the dependency ratio, total dependency ratio and elderly dependency ratio has already started to increase, while the working age share already began to decline rapidly. So as the population aging is going on worldwide, so I think it is vital to analyze the impact of population aging on macroeconomy in a robust way to explore right policy options. And I think this is what this paper tries to do. So the main results of this paper can be summarized into three ways. First, population aging can indeed have substantial impact on economic growth and welfare. Second, however, some smart mix of policies, which are quite feasible, can offset the adverse effects to a great extent. Thirdly, in reality, however, the effectiveness of policy can be ensured only if there is no nullifying response on the part of economic agents. So, about the main features of the model, I just emphasize that one key assumption is that international capital mobility is perfect, and this is vital for buffering the adverse impact from population shock, hitting especially the fast-aging economy. So, to discuss from more general perspective, I'd like to start with a more core, basic question. Why should aging matter for growth? Basically, this is because productivity and economic agents' decision-making may differ over the life cycle and thus have different time profile. So the idea that the shift in age structure can have significant economic implications, I think is become well established. But how to identify it is still very challenging. And there has been two approaches, analytical versus empirical. And the literature has been highlighting the four channels for demography influencing the economy. First is accounting. This is a kind of composition effect. The second is behavioral channel, in which some demographic factors can induce some behavioral response from the economic agents. Third, institutional channel, in which pension system or institutions in the labor market can interact with demographic shifts, resulting in different outcomes across nations. Fourth, global channel, in which different speed of aging and different causes of it can have different outcomes for a specific country through interactions among nations, especially through capital flow. I think that the existence of various channels and possible complexity of interaction among them inevitably require nice analytical models for a solid analysis. But we should be mindful of that. The models also have their own weaknesses associated with assumptions or calibrations. For example, assumptions like perfect capital mobility, time invariant or space invariant preferences, and age invariant probabilities of death for adults, or age invariant productivity, something like that. So I think we need both approaches to enhance our understanding of aging, the impact of aging on the macroeconomy. But I think we found that sometimes it is not that easy to reconcile the results from both approaches, even if they are focusing on advanced economies. And examples abound. For example, regarding aging on per capita income or its growth, models tend to predict lower per capita income and consumption, while some empirical results, including Professor Bloom's paper, indicate differently. And regarding aging on capital flow or current account, empirical results often show that faster aging countries import capital, but models expect the opposite. And to make matters worse, I think, going forward, aging will be more pronounced in some EMEs than in AEs, which is brought up in this session. So I think the the features of economic structure is quite different in EMEs from those in advanced economies. I think modeling aging will be more challenging going forward, I think. So if we accept this current model and its forecast, what will the implication of the model to the aging EMEs and the capital flow and global imbalances? The model predicts that faster aging EMEs capital can be invested in other EMEs with a younger population, and that will benefit both parties. But in reality, if the imperfection of international capital market persists or lag behind the demographic shift, I think capital flow, fast aging EMEs will keep exporting capital to advanced economies with lower return to capital, and which certainly cannot serve for buffering the adverse population shock for the EMEs, only lead to exacerbating global imbalances. So I think there might be another channels, and I'd like to highlight one possible such channels, which is capital intensity or investment channel, which is actually exactly Dr. Bojuspan raised in his presentation. So he asked if aging can lower capital input or labor productivity. I think it probably can. So actually, demographic shift and change in age structure can affect labor productivity at aggregate level as productivity differs over the life cycle. But demographic shift can also affect labor productivity via capital intensity or investment decision on the firm's part. I think this appears to have not been explored much in the literature. So I did some primitive data work and show you the result. This picture shows the labor productivity in G7 since 1990s. If you see the shaded area, measure the labor productivity growth of G7 countries has shown a downward movement since 1990s, and much of this reflects long-term trend. And we decompose labor productivity growth into capital intensity growth and TFP growth. Most of them is explained by the slowdown in capital intensity growth. And we plot some important macroeconomic variables and demographic variables. This is for OECD countries' data. Potential GDP growth is positively related with capital stock growth, and the latter negatively with old age share in the population. And this negative relation is more pronounced in investment ratio and age structure variables. Actually, investment ratio is positively related with working age share, while negatively with dependency ratios in the OECD countries. And we compare the relationship between demography and investment, and that between demography and savings rate. Actually, the former looks tighter in the latter. So this points to a possibility that aging can influence investment more than saving. But the literature, I think, mostly based on the life cycle hypothesis and with a focus on advanced economies, has been emphasizing the role of saving by doing the relatively marginalizing the role of investment. And open economic consideration seems to reinforce such tendency. So I'd like to raise the possibility that demographic shift can trigger behavioral adjustment on the not only from the household, but also from firms. So as long as the firm's decision on locational investment, a locational decision of investment is made on the longer horizon, I think not only the current age structure, but also the expectation of change in age structure can have some kind of impact on the domestic investment. And my colleagues and I found some preliminary results, evidence to support that kind of conjecture. So we did some reduced form regression using G20 panel data. Oh dear. The blue area is the most important result, but you can see. But in your paper, in print, you can see the result. So we can find that actually after controlling the standard determinants of domestic investment, the working age share and the dependence ratio has this significant and expected sign. In addition, the expectation of expectation of increase in all the dependence ratio can have significant and negative sign. On the other hand, expectation of increase in young dependence ratio has a positive sign, even if it is mild. So I think we have to pursue this avenue further. So let me conclude this. It seems that the effects of demographic shift on growth, welfare, and capital flow are not fully understood yet. And as the demographic shift will be more drastic in EMs going forward, I think the role of financial market features, like degree of financial market development or extent of financial frictions, seems to warrant more attention going forward. And considering that adjustment of exchange rate is important in cross-national interaction, especially capital flow, I think it also should be included in the model more explicitly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our presenters and discussants have given us a lot to sort of go over here. Very good presentations, a lot of information. In fact, we've actually slightly overrun our target, but the organizers, I think, would allow maybe a small number of questions. I, in particular, interested in your reaction to what you attributed to the Krugman question. I think of it as a Jorge question because we have a member of our board of directors from a labor union who is quite skeptical of the ability to extend retirement ages. Another question for Axel was that one of his reforms was to get people into the labor force a couple of years sooner. And actually, that sort of surprised me, because I would have thought that with longer lives, we would want people to spend more time in school and invest for the long term. So I was a little confused about what was going on there. I see Barry Eichengreen has a question.
I both have a comment, a two-word comment, and a question. The two-word comment is North Korea. That I thought we had a very well-informed discussion of demographic challenges and possible policy responses in Korea. But what makes the Korean case exceptional, in addition to the way it's been telescoped, is there is a way of dealing. There's a much younger population where the demographic transition is between 1 and 2 generations behind, just to the north. That doesn't, it introduces other issues, but it doesn't introduce the cultural dimension that immigration often does, where one to assume some kind of integration between the two economies. And the question was to ask the two speakers why they are skeptical about the prospects for and evidence on pronatalist policies. My casual observation of the literature is that cases like France, where tax policy has been adjusted to encourage fertility, there have been sizable effects.
Jung Won Yoon, please.
Thank you. Well, I found Professor Broom's presentation very useful, and but I still have a puzzle or a simple question that remains unanswered. You expressed concerns about the labor supply issue, but as you know, for the time being, the binding constraint is not supply and demand. So there are a lot of significant number of unemployed, in de facto unemployed number will be, some newspapers citing, which is millions. So my question is, if I follow your policy, suggested policy responses such as later retirement or immigration, then it will further increase labor supply rather than addressing labor demand issues. So when do I need to concern about the binding labor demand issue? Thank you.
Why don't the two presenters take a shot at those questions, please?
Just a response to a comment Dr. Chang made, which I think he raised a very interesting point about health improvements. Because it is possible that health today, or age today, means something different than it meant 20 years ago, and that in 20 years it's going to mean something different. So we hear sometimes about 60 is the new 50, or 70 might be the new 60, whatever. There's a hypothesis that's been kicking around in the field. It's called the compression of morbidity. It's basically the idea that that not only are we adding years to life through greater life expectancy, but we're also adding life to years through better health, and that that we're compressing the morbid years into a smaller part at a later and later part of the life cycle. And I think it's quite important, actually, if true. That this idea that we're postponing the age at which our minds and our bodies break down and we lose our functional independence. I think it's important because it actually says something about our capacity to work at our old ages, probably about our willingness and interest in working, and our productivity at those ages as well. I did not actually raise it because in recent years, some doubt has been cast upon that, the evidence. In the U.S., there's actually most of the evidence we have is for the U.S., I think, and it's kind of mixed. But it's a very, very important hypothesis with important economic ramifications. So I'm glad you raised it. And it actually also touches upon something else that's been going on in the U.S., which I think was raised earlier, And that is, I think Professor Gordon mentioned the declining labor force participation rate. And Dan, you mentioned it, for every age group below age 60. But it turns out for those 60 and above, the labor force participation rate in the U.S. has been going up steadily for 2 decades and appears to be going up especially sharply for the more educated, which I think is kind of relevant to this discussion as well. And on the health issue, just one other point here about the 60 and over. I actually, in preparation for this meeting, I was able to take a look at microdata from health and retirement surveys from many, many countries. I think I had 17 different countries. So it's large, high-quality microdata on health and retirement. And we took a look at people who were not in the labor, who were over age 60 and not in the labor force, and we basically tried to figure out why they're not in the labor force. And it turns out that more than half of them attribute it to something other than their health, which I think suggests that actually raising the retirement age, right, if people are not in the labor force at over age 60 because they're not healthy, raising the retirement age is not going to have any big effect on the labor force. But I think that's not the case. It looks like it would probably have a significant effect on the labor force. So maybe I'll turn it over to Axel for a minute.
Yeah, I also would like to pick up the health and the productivity, because there's this underlying question: can retirement really be extended by 5 years, 10 years, maybe even? So if you look at health at younger ages, and I call between 60 and 70 younger age, you do see a decline, but the decline is really small. So you're far away from the times when compression of morbidity or the opposite actually kicks in. So as long as we talk extending working life to 70, health is not an issue. Productivity might be an issue. And I've done a lot of work on really micro estimates of productivity using microdata. And in sort of tailorized production environments, you don't see any kind of decline of productivity. This may be different in high-level jobs. Obviously, soccer players do not go into age 70, but that's not what all people do. The compression of morbidity story, there is now evidence in Europe, and it shows that there is still a compression of morbidity going on. If you look at the United States, it's a different story for the, say, lower part of the income distribution and the upper part of the income distribution. And that tells you something which may be behind these causes. 2 more comments, but very brief. To send young people earlier into jobs doesn't mean that their education has been worse. The continental European countries have very late job entry dates, much later than the United States, or not to speak of Asia. So just making them equal to the United States doesn't seem to harm really education. Just to take, obviously, education processes are pretty inefficient and I'm convinced education is very inefficient in France and Germany and in Italy. Pronatal policies, that's a difficult question. There are very few there are very few experiments which you can interpret causally, because the number of daycare facilities and birth rate is obviously causation goes either way. So you have to find nice policy experiments. We had one in Germany, the unification. Where East Germany had a lot of daycare facilities, West Germany did not. And if you do some fine-grained econometrics, then you do see an effect in East Germany. But when we tried to reproduce the same effect the other way around in West Germany, it vanished. And that's very typical for these kind of studies. You find examples where it seems to work and you have good evidence, but then you transfer to another country or even another part of a country and the evidence goes away. This is why I'm so skeptical about the evidence in that respect.
Thank you. I think we should probably stop. I know that there are some festivities planned, coffee break, et cetera. So why don't we thank our presenters and discussants one more time.